seeing and hearing is one of the very few electric instruments produced in China during the late 1970s. This is the Yema YM-8501. It's essentially a portable electronic organ with two voices, a lead and a rhythm. It doesn't have any of the functionality of a traditional synthesizer, no filter, no LFOs, but there's quite a few secrets inside this thing. It's the rhythm function of this thing that is so unhinged and practically has a mind of its own. If I can guess, it is the namesake of this instrument, the wild horse. So if you're into synthesizers, you must know that some of the best synthesizers were developed in America and Japan during, starting in the late 1960s. But if you're really into synthesizers, you might know that a few other countries produced synthesizers around this time as well. German, Russian, Italian synths, now they're all super rare and highly sought after, and also wildly expensive. Some have a really magical sound as a result of their all, analog and unique circuitry. But speaking to you from Chengdu, China, I've been starting to wonder, there was a huge industrial boom in China back then. Were they making electronic instruments in China during the 1970s and 80s? There were a few decades of Chinese technology which never left its borders and were really never explored by anyone outside the country. This is a fun story at the cross-section of music and geopolitics. In 1973, a man called Bernie Krause, described then as a soundscape ecologist, brought the very first synthesizer China would ever see into the country as a part of a US government-sponsored trip under the Nixon administration to showcase new technologies to the Chinese government. Bernie and his partner, in an effort to showcase what the synthesizer could do, programmed some synthesized tones that sounded like traditional Chinese instruments. If I can guess, it sounded something like this. The Americans explained that this was a technology that could effectively emulate or create any sound that you could imagine. The craziest part of this story is that apparently the Chinese government officials who were the first to see this synthesizer technology saw it and they loved it. Around that time, there was a clear distinction between Western instruments like violin, piano, everything else, and traditional Chinese instruments, which were, at that time, receiving a huge return to relevance thanks to, the party. Instruments were all being reinvented and encouraged to be studied en masse. Those Chinese government officials looked at this new instrument and they formally declared, on behalf of the Chinese government of the late 70s, that the synthesizer does not have any cultural bias. They believed that the concept of synthesis wasn't inherently Western, and as a result, it should be accepted by Chinese musicians to use in Chinese arrangements. This is the truest origin of electronic music in China. Now, after all this happened, did China end up building their own synthesizers? In one lone instance, yes, they did. Tianjin Qing was this maverick inventor who, in 1978, developed what he called the Dianzi Qin. Dianzi meaning electric, and qin meaning a type of instrument, whether it's a piano or like a dulcimer, a Chinese family of instruments.
电子琴也有不同的类型，这是一台弦控式电子琴，它是山西太原电子乐器研究所田进琴工程师创制的。
It was a pretty simple but elegant synth, using this sort of single ribbon design based on how the Chinese erhu is played. He combined that control mechanism with an analog synthesizer that I believe was like an additive synth, sort of like an old electric organ. Info is really hard to find on the Chinese internet, but this truly was the first recorded instance of a Chinese-made synthesizer. Now, for a number of reasons, this prototype never went commercial. Mostly because it was expensive, and some of the components were just prohibitively difficult to manufacture en masse at a price that people could afford. Tianjin Qin continued his work and is actually still around making a version of his original synthesizer today, almost entirely unknown to the Western world. And he's been continuing his work throughout these years. He's founded an institute on the study of electronic instruments in China and is still a renowned lecturer and professor. If this little documentary goes well, we'll see if we can reach out and try to meet him, and then we'll do a follow-up. But for the most part, innovation on synthesizers in China were greatly outpaced by, the other synthesizer manufacturing countries of the world. And with a cultural landscape that promoted preservationism over innovation, there just wouldn't be any demand for Tian's new synth here in China. Not for many years, not even today. There just wasn't a need for developing new sonic textures in Chinese music yet. The ambition of those Chinese government officials who, gave Moog a visa were, apparently just abandoned. But the Chinese people did want a new instrument. They wanted something that they could play folk songs with. They wanted one that could keep a rhythm for them. They wanted it to be easy to carry around, simple to learn, and loud as hell. In the 1980s, learning piano became really common in China, as did electronics and electronic manufacturing, especially in the bustling international city that is Shanghai. This led to a generation of mostly toy manufacturers creating these little electronic pianos, which would become, nostalgic in their own right, nameless toys from the past. Some people grew up playing these, or more often, their grandparents learned to play them, and the kids would listen along. For those few, these instruments might have their place in history. But for most people, these small brand pianos would just be lost to history. The nostalgic value just doesn't compare to modern cheap keys from around the world, which did a lot more marketing, such as Casio and Yamaha. So whether or not they've got a potential for a comeback, I figured it would be worth adding these little guys to the zeitgeist of weird and wonderful esoteric electric instruments. Hence this video. Alright, so admittedly, my intention on buying one of these was actually just to find the cheapest possible electric instrument I could find. I'm starting to practice some basic electronic repair, PCB diagnostic, and maybe a little circuit bending. I wanted a vintage one because I knew that inside the circuitry would be bigger and, easier to mess around with. I found this guy very cheap on Shanghai, which is the Chinese equivalent to eBay, for about 45 RMB, which is almost $7 US. Now, before shipping, the seller refused to test it. Why? Because it requires 6 D batteries. I had to spend more on the new batteries than I did on the antique, go figure. 6 D batteries go for about 50 RMB in China, so now the price is about $15. So there were other ones available too, by other companies. They all seem to have kind of the same functionality and kind of the same sound. Back in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of copycat development in Chinese electronics. Some of them are probably exactly the same on the inside with just a different body. I would be really hard-pressed to figure out who made this first. Yema is likely not the first electronic organ mass-produced in China, but according to what little information I could find about it, it's certainly one of the earlier ones, because the later ones tended to get more functionality, better keys, and, more common power supplies. There's a clip of Tianjin Qin going around playing a similar looking organ, although it seems to have a ribbon keyboard on it, and it's very possible that he was the first person to develop this sort of thing in China. again, information is scarce. Okay, so for the record, I'm throwing out lots of words like synthesizer, piano, organ. This is what we would technically consider an electric organ. It is not a synthesizer. It lacks a lot of the components of what we would define as a synthesizer, mainly a filter and envelopes and etc. I'm only making the comparison because what Tianjin set out to make was very much a synthesizer. This is the closest thing to a synthesizer that was mass-produced during that era in China. So that's why I figured it's worth talking about and making the comparison. But for the record, not a synthesizer. This is the architecture of the wild horse. So on the left side, we have several voices that contribute to the Yīnsè, which they call Timbre, but more appropriately, it is the leading voice. Quick note, the baritones in this thing are indescribably terrible. They're so harsh and grating, so I'm going to play them back at a low level. But also some things are really disproportionately loud compared to other sounds, so when I'm editing, I'll do my best to give you like an accurate representation of what this thing really sounds like. Ready for this? Here's the leading voice. Forgive me as I play it backwards. Camera-wise, this seemed to be best. So that's kind of what the leading voice is all about, right? It's a monophonic instrument, so the keybed is super, super simple. It's actually kind of interesting. It's these little bent copper pieces, actually all one piece, pressing down on a single metal strip, and pressing a key will interrupt the circuit at that point. And what that also means is that it has high note priority. Now, when I was taking this thing apart, I noticed that the bottom key, this note right here, it's on a completely different circuit than the rest of the keys. Weird. And when you play that low note, it doesn't make a sound. Also weird. But if you use the lowest note in conjunction with another key, it unlocks a hidden voice within this Yīnsè, within this timbre. Check this out. That's so cool. Like, why did they just wedged in this like octave down button on the keybed itself, like as a performance effect? Like if you're playing with both hands, like why did they do that? That's so cool. Now, obviously, there's no velocity on this thing, but it's funny, if you listen really close and play quickly enough, you can hear not just glissando, but also all the weird glitchiness that's coming from playing notes on a singular strip of metal here. Sometimes it's a little bit of glissando, sometimes it's just outright glitchiness. And my favorite is like when you play a note and like the note doesn't quite make it, and you kind of get this weird, like atonal sound. Let me see if I can make it happen. There it is. You hear that? Like it doesn't quite land on the note sometimes. And worth noting that a lot of times on these cheap little electric pianos, the black notes are just for show, but on this one, the black notes are very much notes themselves. I also noticed that they're reasonably weaker in terms of their consistency of tone, so if you're really going for glitchiness, play that pentatonic scale. He's trying, he's real trying. So, this sort of behavior is 100% coming from the circuitry, those analog parts. It's not good, and it's really not intentional, but you gotta say it is, like, it's wild in the way it handles. Wild horse. All right, this thing has a speaker built inside of it, and I cannot express to you how loud this little thing can get. It is so loud, and these square waves and all these terrible gritty sounds are just so piercing and so bad. And when you play a bass note, you can actually feel the whole instrument vibrate in your hands, and it's magical in a way. Like you can really feel this thing when you play it, and I don't think I have any electronic instruments that do that. Nearly 50 years old, and this thing can pack such a punch. So right now I'll show you a speaking test. I'm gonna compare the sound of the speaker of this thing to my normal speaking voice. Okay, speaking test, ready? This is the sound of my speaking voice, and then if I were to play the lead, I'm speaking to you at full volume. Oh god, it's so bad. I try the lower notes. This is me talking to you at like a pretty loud volume. Oh my god. Oh my god. What's so funny is that you cannot turn this speaker off. I actually had to cut the speaker wire to this throughout making most of this video and all my research, just because it's so obnoxiously loud that I couldn't do this in the studio. It's just, it hurts my ears after a couple minutes. It's bad. Maybe the funniest thing is that this thing even has aux output in case you need to get any louder. But the aux output doesn't disable the speaker. Like on some synthesizers, right? If you plug in the aux, then if it's got an internal speaker, the internal speaker will switch off, right? Because it thinks you want to use a bigger speaker. But not this thing. This thing will it'll play both. It'll play out of its own speaker and wherever you're sending this. I also noticed that the volume of this thing is entirely in the first 5% of the knob. Watch this. It's like it's off, it starts loud, and then it only gets a little bit louder. So, I'm no electrician, but my guess is that they definitely just used the wrong potentiometer here, a potentiometer with the wrong ohm rating. Like, I don't think that's damage. I just think that's like a manufacturing mistake. Like, it's fine. They probably had like a big box of potentiometers at the factory, and the dude reached in and dropped it on the board. But potentiometers all generally look the same, and when they're making hundreds of these, they probably just messed it up. I'm sure the quality control at these factories in Shanghai back in the late 70s were less than ideal. All right, I'm gonna go into these voices with a little more detail, okay? The Yīnsè, the lead, okay, there's 5 switches, and they're mostly very harsh square waves, although some of them are a bit more like sawtooth. They're just bare-bone electric oscillators. There's no real manipulation of these sounds. You can mix any of these 5, but there's no FM, there's no real mixing them. They're just kind of additive, like stacking on top of each other. It's nothing really too complex. Now, I put it through an oscilloscope because I was having a really hard time interpreting what these wave shapes are and what the sounds they're making are. And I pulled up some wavetables on Omnisphere just to make some visual comparisons, because I'm not really too good at this. So here's my findings. Again, feel free to comment and correct them. Voice number 1 is just like a harsh square. Voice number 2 is like a very weak sawtooth, sort of like the EDP Wasp synth, that old weird experimental synth from back in the day. And the point is, I don't think you would use that one on its own, but if you mix the two together, there's some kind of tone building there. It's very minimal, but I think that's the point here. Okay, voice number 3. I don't really know what you would call this. It's sort of like a very messy triangle wave. The closest I could find on Omnisphere was like the square wave of a JX3P. Listen. Yeah, I'm not totally sure that these kind of specific waves even have names, I might just be grasping at straws here. I'm really not all that good at, wavetables and understanding what these different oscillators do. This is just some random oscillators from the 70s in China, so I don't think they had much idea either, but here we are, trying to put names to it. Voice number 4 is very similar to voice number 3, although it sounds like it's been put through some kind of, like, filter. It's like some non-parametric, listen. It's also an octave down now. So again, you play them together and it makes more sense, right? So it does sound a bit more like a sine wave, I suppose, because it's a little bit softer. And voice number 5 sounds the same as voice number 1, put through that same kind of filter thing. Listen. Eventually, I'll look through the circuit board and try to figure out where these sounds are exactly coming from, if they're all coming from the same circuits. And part of me wants to guess that some of these are going through another component which softens the sound, like some kind of, analog filter thing, which has got to be awfully cheap and not sounding too good. But, if I can guess, 4 and 5 are coming from the same places as voices 3 and 1. Going through again, some kind of thing. But I don't know. I'm no expert on this sort of thing. I'm sure, a DIY synth guy would love to get their hands on one of these. In addition to the lead, we also have the accompanying sound. The word they use is Jíezòu, which is rhythm. I mentioned this before. It's seemingly simple, but there's really a lot going on here. So I'm going to do my best to show you exactly how this thing works. Without changing any settings, we enable the rhythm function by just turning up its volume. Now you hear a beep. It's kind of like a kick. It sounds like they're trying to do a kick drum. However, the red beep here, this is the downbeat. This is the 1. 1, 2, 1, 2. Right now we're in a 2-4 time signature because both of these are switched up. So why is the kick happening on the upbeat? I couldn't tell you. I'm not actually sure if this section has the intention of being like drum accompaniment or if it really is just like a metronome, but it does sound like a kick and it could have been like a beep. So I'm thinking they're trying to do some kind of drum. Let's explore how this thing works. Now, I don't know if you can hear it, but there's a very, very, very quiet click on the downbeat. It is very, very, very quiet compared to that kick drum. And I'm going to keep calling it the kick drum, even though it's on the upbeat. Now, if I play a note, it's going to create 2 additional sounds. Okay, here we go. Suddenly, the drum goes away, and we hear, first of all, a note, which is 1 octave down from where this note is originally played. For example, if I were to turn on the lead here and play them both together, listen. So the downbeat, that kick, is playing down an octave from, what your lead would be. I don't know why. It's also creating a secondary tone, which is like a very quiet, weak sawtooth wave, if you listen. Now, it's up to you if you think that that's a conscious effort on the part of these Chinese engineers from 50-something years ago, or if it's just some, electrical hum. Maybe it is a clever attempt at adding some polyphony to this thing, but to be honest, it just sounds like harsh noise. Terrible so far. What else can we do with this? First of all, you might notice that the drum has gone away. That kick drum has just disappeared. And now we're just left with 2 very, very quiet clicks. However, if I happen to play just like a couple more notes, it's back. Now, what's the logic there? Your guess is as good as mine. It's probably just a piece of shit, but, what do I know? There's some simple functionality here, right? This is, your time signature. Right now we're in 2-4. If I switch this one here, so now we're in 3-4 time, and it's quite clear that that red beep here, this is the downbeat. So it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. We have beeps on those second and third upbeats, right? Similarly, if I were to switch this to 4-4 time, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, if that beep was, on the downbeat, maybe a bit more helpful. But, give a listen if I were to play a note and how these different time signatures work out. And if I were to throw in a lead here, so maybe you can hear a bit of potential there, more so than me. Right now it just sounds pretty bad, but you know, that's the default functionality of this thing, okay? So let's keep this in 4/4. Oh, and by the way, if you just switch both of these together, doesn't matter, it just defaults to 4/4. So it's 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, still 4/4, okay? Nothing, no secrets there. These two Jíezòu switches here, these two functionality switches are where things get a little crazy, like a little wild, you know, maybe a little drunk, I don't know. The first one switches, if I'm right, the first one switches the kick with the quarter note of the note that you're playing. Kick is still there, but so again, that note is there. So if I add that first functionality switch, it just takes that note and it throws it down the octave. That kick is still going sometimes, not too much control over that, but you can hear what that first functionality does. The second switch takes the tone on the upbeat and brings it down an octave. So if I were to play a note, hear that? It's just taking that weird little, that tone that you're generating and brings it down an octave, which, you know, maybe it makes more context in the sense of playing with a lead. Let's find out. For the real wild horses out there, if you switch both of them together, you get all downbeats, no upbeats. And without the lead, I've also neglected to mention that this third knob here is for BPM. So if you want to change your BPM to something a little bit faster, then of course you can do that. Yeah, you know, like when the BPM gets a little bit faster, it's definitely a little bit more interesting what this rhythm can do. In retrospect, I should have been demonstrating them all at a pretty high, high BPM, but we'll have some fun with it. So, in theory, the designers of this instrument added the rhythm section to help keep time when playing alone or leading like a small ensemble because, you know, it's a metronome, it's a drum section all in one. And a lot of folk music is very, very clear sense of rhythm because it's easier to remember. But I think the unintentional side effect of putting a rhythm function in a device like this is it gives you just enough voices to make some very weird and interesting electronic music, which musicians of the 70s might have never experienced, never expected. So between the triggerable voices, the weird behavior of the rhythm, we've kind of reached the end of the features of this thing. It's unambitious. It's not meant to do more than crank out a melody at incredibly loud and piercing volume. It does that all too well. So after this, Yamaha would become the de facto king on electric pianos in China. Keyboards would fill the need of all these Chinese musicians for the next several decades, and even today, Romplers that make realistic traditional instrument sounds are really what the country's music producers consider groundbreaking. Of course, there's a good number of them using synthesizers that are imported from the West or, brought in, but for the most part, in the traditional Chinese produced instrument world, it's actually just a lot of Romplers imitating, traditional instruments. Just a quick anecdote, I was invited to perform at a consortium of Chinese instrument producers 2 years ago in Beijing. One of the winners of the new innovating instrument of the year was really just like a Rompler keyboard with pre-recorded Chinese instrument sounds and like expression keys like you do on like Contact or Complete instruments. That's all that they want for now, I guess. There's really not too much of a pioneering spirit yet. You'll find some weird Chinese electric instruments out there, some Romplers, little electronic things. But for the most part, there's not much development of electronic music devices with inherently Chinese characteristics. I reckon the recent release of Native Instruments East Asia might be one of the biggest jumps forwards in that department, and Native Instruments recently started up shop here in China, so, we'll see how that all develops. So how about the synth scene in China these days? Well, there's just not enough demand for an internal synth production market, and, the market's definitely dominated by, the big players, both in the West and out in Japan and whatnot. There are more and more electronic music producers every year. There's a couple group chats going around with all the music producers in one spot. There's definitely more and more electronic music being made. As for electronic instruments being produced here, it's really, really not so much. There's obviously a few manufacturing plants here that build synthesizers for Western companies. Now about small companies doing synthesizers and whatnot, believe it or not, there's actually a few modular units being designed by Chinese engineers here. Because there's music or not, there's a very thriving DIY electronics scene here. You may have heard of Moog instruments. I know he and his team make some pretty nifty effects, a resonator, a synth, and some other things. But beyond him, there's not too many of these guys out there that have an online shop. I've met a few who do make their own brand of stuff, but they're not, industrialized enough to sell it, especially to you synth collectors out there, or even someone like me. You'd have to be here and talk to them and, tell them what you want and, commission it, really. So it's mostly DIY for now. In Chengdu alone, in this city, I've met 3 people just at a bar or whatever who say that they've produced their own modules. Because prototyping in China is going to be cheaper than anywhere else on Earth right now. There's so many people out there who are trying to make little modules that do different things. So I will do my best to look them up, and if I find people who are willing to sell their models, I will put a link in the description if you want to support the people out here. And hopefully as the years go on, quite a few more people will take their PCB designs or whatever and manufacture them and send them out into the world. So, as for the fate of our dear friend, the Yema, what happened? I couldn't find too much about what happened to the brand or the model or anything, except for one thing. On the Chinese internet, the one thing you can find quite easily are trademark filings and any sort of law filings. They're all public information on the Chinese internet. So if you search a company, the first thing you're gonna find is trademarks and any sort of business registration, how much a company has registered and etc. So a quick search for this particular company and this brand of Yema came up with just one request to renew the trademark in Inner Mongolia, of all places. However, it seems the trademark renewal was denied. What does that mean? I'm no expert on Chinese law filings, but it just seems like this thing is really lost to the ages. As for the fate of the toy company, I also couldn't really tell you what had happened, but I just had a hard time finding any information about it. Regardless, this brand is not a household name. It's not something you can find anywhere. This thing really is, it's gone. It's done. It begs the question, do these kind of things deserve to be remembered? There's a huge comeback of old Casio synths, omnichords, cassette tape, all the worst parts of making music back in the day are finding their place in contemporary experimental music and are all over Instagram and YouTube. The musicians who dig into these kind of instruments will tell you that there's something really creatively liberating about wrestling with an old analog piece of gear like this, letting its limitations sort of guide you into making something you wouldn't have made if you had access to something with a bit more functionality. So for that reason, it's probably worth remembering. Now, I'm not old enough to have any sort of real nostalgia for this thing. I didn't grow up here, so I'd never heard this thing until I found it on Shenyu. And it unobjectively sounds just bad, terrible, on its own. But I gotta say, rescuing it for, about $15, giving it a couple hours of time, just messing around with its sounds and just trying to make it sound a little bit better, it's been worth the challenge. It's been fun. And, giving life to something kind of old and forgotten has just been rewarding, especially in another part of the world. That's the real kicker. So, I would certainly encourage you all to, if you're traveling the world and find yourself making music in a faraway country, if you happen to find something domestically made, to definitely give it a shot and see what comes out of it. I'll do my best to give this thing some new life, and I'll bring it out on the road sometime. And if you have any particular interest in trying to get your hands on one of these, they are super cheap. Shipping to the West might be a little pricey, especially these days. But they're out there. They're out there in mass. There's a whole bunch. If you have any particular interest in one of these models, feel free to hit me up, and I'll see what I can do to help out. Okay. So it's been fun. I'm Yīnsè, based in Chengdu, China. This is Kiwi, and thanks for watching. I'll see you soon. Come on. I know. We're done, Kiwi. We're done. Okay, now you can sit wherever you want.